All right, good afternoon and welcome everyone to Network 2020's discussion about the race for AI between China and the US. My name is Courtney Doggart and I am the president of Network 2020. Before I introduce our terrific panelists, I just wanted to say a few words about Network 2020. So we are a New York City-based nonprofit, and our mission is really to bring nuanced and incisive conversations about global affairs to rising and established leaders, both virtually around the world as well as in person in New York. We have a really great season of events coming up, and so I encourage you to follow us on LinkedIn, on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, to subscribe to our YouTube channel or Global Insights podcast to access our library of on-the-record discussions. And so with that, it is my pleasure to introduce our three guests today. So first, we have Owen Daniels. He is Associate Director of Analysis and a Fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology. And previously, he worked at the Joint Advanced Warfighting Division at the Institute for Defense Analyses. Next, I am very pleased to welcome Janet Egan. She is a senior fellow with the Technology and National Security Program at the Center for New American Security. And before she was at CNAS, she was a director in the Australian Government Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet and worked on the Prime Minister's Task Force on Critical Technologies, among other projects. And last, I am very pleased to welcome Sam Winter-Levy, who is a fellow in the Technology and International Affairs program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And our conversation will be moderated today by Network 2020 member and senior advisor Joanna Waszewski, who has her PhD in international relations from Oxford and is an author and policy advisor on international affairs. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. And Joanna, over to you.
Thank you so much, Courtney. The United States is generally recognized as the global leader in artificial intelligence, or AI, a technology that is profoundly changing how America conducts its domestic and foreign policies. China, which is also aggressively pursuing its own AI capabilities, was until recently seen as years behind the US in its development. To ensure US dominance, the Biden administration had enacted a variety of measures and controls, including export bans on semiconductor chips to restrict Beijing's access to US technology. America's confidence in its AI dominance was undermined, however, with the launch of China's artificial intelligence startup DeepSeek, an open AI platform using domestically produced semiconductor chips. The Trump administration's response to DeepSeek was to modify the export controls on chips and to launch its own AI action plan to ensure that America remains the global leader for the foreseeable future. This technological race between the US and China raises numerous questions. Will America be able to continue its superiority over AI technology, and what will be needed to sustain it? Or will China overtake the US? And if so, what advantages does Beijing have that increases its chance for success? What other countries are hoping to join this AI race? Will we see a world eventually split into two or more different AI systems? And how will countries decide which to adopt? I look forward to discussing these and other questions with our distinguished panel today. So let me begin with you, Owen. What is meant by AI capabilities? And could you provide a brief summary of the competition between the US and China under the Biden administration?
Yes, so thanks, Joanna. Really glad to be participating today. Happy to do a little scene setting in terms of what we're discussing when we focus on AI capabilities and competition. So broadly speaking, AI capabilities can encompass everything that an AI system is capable of doing. So I think today, especially in the moments kind of after ChatGPT, there's been a focus on AI's capabilities processing and generating language, but we're also talking about AI's capability to understand images or audio, make predictions based on large data sets, and solving more complex problems that typically require human intelligence. So when we're talking about AI capabilities, they can be narrow and specialized when you think of systems like image recognition or speech to text, or they could be broad and adaptable as when you think about generative models. I think it's also important to consider capabilities from an organizational perspective when it comes to AI. So it can also refer to a organization or state's ability to effectively select, manage, use AI technologies, and to harness the data resources, human capital, and infrastructure in order to implement AI solutions to problems. So I think that really emphasizes the aspect of AI that's dependent on effective human-machine teaming and the ability to use AI to kind of gain decision advantages, as some militaries and states refer to it. So just on the Biden and kind of doing the scene setting before the Trump administration, a lot of the kind of competition that's gone on in AI has primarily been around the economic interactions between US and Chinese firms, and also concerns about national security when it comes to AI. So obviously the US and China are home to many of the world's leading AI firms. Think of Google, OpenAI, Microsoft, Alibaba, DeepSeek, ByteDance, the list kind of goes on. And so one aspect of competition has to do with kind of spreading market share and companies being integrated into platforms and processes across the globe. The other aspect is, from a national security perspective, incorporating AI into military capabilities. So you can think autonomous systems, decision support, and battle space systems, and then some of the back-end sustainment processes that help militaries function more efficiently. These are all areas where, for a decade or more, the United States and China have seen AI as playing an important role. However, I think 2023 is kind of the watershed moment when you come to thinking about US-China competition in AI. That's when we saw this kind of large language model, generative model explosion, most notably with ChatGPT, but a number of other companies. And there we started to see concerns that general purpose models that were really powerful, like ChatGPT, could potentially be used for game-changing societal, economic, security advances. And so you alluded to some of the policies that the Biden administration enacted to try to keep the US ahead when it comes to generative models. That included kind of domestic subsidies in the form of the CHIPS Act, where you had $280 billion in domestic spending to build the compute for powerful generative models. But it also spoke to the export controls that you mentioned. And I think notably, we saw a national security memorandum last fall from the Biden administration, kind of laying out the priority of establishing US dominance in generative models for national security, followed by a range of export controls in December with a diffusion rule on advanced chips. So things have changed a little bit under the Trump administration, but I imagine we'll kind of get to that over the course of our conversation.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Yes, and so actually I will turn to you, Janet, to talk about what is the Trump administration's approach to AI, and how does it differ so far to that of Biden?
Thanks, Joanna. I think one way of looking at it is there's continued bipartisan support for American AI leadership, but a very different philosophy of how to get there. And Owen started to touch on this as well. So we've seen this shift from the Biden administration's approach of lock it down, protect the US lead, make sure that, we're carefully controlling who gets these capabilities. And we saw that come up through the AI diffusion rule, which was briefly introduced by the Biden administration. But since the Trump administration has taken office, we've seen a shift to more of an emphasis on promote and spreading the US technology globally. So we started to see this as soon as February at the Paris AI Action Summit. JD Vance made comments around not being paralyzed by the concepts of AI risks. They're still speculative. We need to ensure we're removing the barriers to innovation and actually driving this forward. In May, we saw massive deals with AI chips. So previously, these were the things that the Biden administration had been really carefully trying to control. But now we're seeing these deals that let a 5 gigawatt cluster be built in the United Arab Emirates for AI development and deployment. Previously, that idea had been floating around the Biden administration for a very long time, but everyone was concerned that that could give the potential for another country to leapfrog the US lead. In July, the AI Action Plan came out, and there's specific measures in this plan that focus on exporting all levels of the AI technology stack around the world. And more recently, we've even heard potential deals about selling AI chips to China. So President Trump has made clear that he sees the H20 chip, which is a chip designed for AI deployment, not AI training, being fine to send to China. And there's now even discussion about even more upgraded versions of such chips being sent to China. So there's a really big shift in approach. I think one of the things underlining this is a belief systems of the future, and lays the foundations there.
Okay, and actually, if you could just explain one thing for those of us who are not as familiar, what you mean by technology stack. What does that entail?
Yeah, great question. So I guess it refers to all the different components that are involved in the supply chain, but also the use of a technology. So you might think of the AI stack including things like the chips you need to get the computational power to deploy AI. You also need then the programming languages to use these chips for good purposes. Then you've got the applications. What are you actually using AI for? And so it goes all the way through to the end user. I think to date, some discussions in the US government have been, wow, China previously has been really good at full stack technology exports. It goes to emerging countries and says, wow, you want this outcome? We're going to help you get there, and we're going to provide the full stack of technologies that you need to achieve this from A to Z. Now, the US is starting to move more into this space for AI. So rather than thinking, let's just let the private sector deploy individual offerings as they see fit, they're trying to coordinate more of a structured approach to say, let's make this as easy as possible for other countries to opt into the US stack, the US technology offering.
Great, thank you. And so continue with the action plan, what's in it more precisely. Sam, I'd like to ask you this. Do you think the action plan adequately addresses what America's priorities should be, and what would you add or change?
Sure. So yeah, thanks so much for having me here and for the question. So I think the action plan overall is a broadly kind of sensible approach to AI policy. I think it's a kind of surprisingly consensus oriented document for in the context of other kind of policies that this administration has produced. So I think a lot of AI observers were kind of pleasantly surprised by the action plan. There is a very different tone from policies that came out of the Biden administration, very different rhetoric, much more emphasis on kind of US dominance. But in terms of the actual substance of the policies, I think there's actually quite a bit of continuity. So both the Biden administration and the Trump administration in the action plan put a lot of emphasis on trying to increase government adoption of AI tools, trying to kind of speed up the way the government the way the government works using these AI tools. Both administrations emphasized reforming kind of permitting and regulatory obstacles to try to speed up the ability to kind of build big data centers to train and deploy these models. So there are some kind of areas of continuity, but there are also some big differences. In general, the AI action plan takes a much more sort of pro-business approach, much more focused on kind of stripping red tape. There was some of that in the Biden administration, but I think this action plan really leans into it. In terms of what I think is kind of really missing from it, I think there are several kind of big areas. The first is high-skilled immigration. So high-skilled immigration is just critical for training these models, building the best companies. You look at the kind of the top staff at all of the major companies, whether it's OpenAI, Meta, Anthropic, and they're just filled with high-skilled immigrants. And the action plan doesn't say anything at all about this issue. China is putting a big emphasis on producing new science PhDs, trying to attract talent, trying to attract foreign researchers. That's historically been a kind of huge strength of the US. But the action plan just doesn't say anything at all about this, and that's because obviously immigration is just a huge, there's deep hostility to immigration from parts of the Republican Party, and the kind of pro-tech wing of the Republican Party, which is generally more sympathetic to high-skilled immigration, is just not prepared to kind of pick a fight on this issue. So I think immigration is one area where the action plan is pretty silent. Another issue is kind of labor risks. I think this is kind of a hotly debated question, the extent to which AI may lead to job losses, may lead to kind of automation of jobs that kind of pushes kind of white collar workers out of business in the long run. Economists are very divided on this question. In general, this administration has really leaned into a kind of pro-tech, being pretty dismissive of the risks of automation, generally thinks that maybe there'll be short-term disruption, but in the long run, it's unlikely to lead to high degrees of unemployment. The action plan doesn't say anything at all about navigating this transition. So I think that's another area where there's some some omissions. And then I think the third one is the risks associated with the models, the risks associated with the misuse of these models, or the models kind of going out of control, bio risks. The action plan actually talks quite a bit about some of these issues, and it recommends a lot of policies for other parts of government to work on these things, a lot of which is very sensible. But a lot of those parts of government have also seen kind of big cuts in their capacity to actually implement these policies. Lots of job disruptions, Doge, a lot of at the best of times, the government struggled to hire high-skilled talent to work on these issues. And I would not say that the government has more capability now than it did, a few months ago. So I think the big question marks there are not so much about the content of the action plan, which I think is very sensible, talks about a lot of these risks, talks about the risks that you could potentially use these AI models to design new kind of biological weapons, new weapon systems of various kinds, new cyber capabilities. It's not so much the kind of content of the plan; it's more just a big question mark over whether they'll be able to implement this, given the lack of state capacity across the federal bureaucracy at the moment.
Great. Thank you for that great summary. Janet, I'd like to turn back to you. So given all of this, what should the US do to maintain its AI superiority? I mean, you mentioned in a recent publication, for example, the importance of partnerships. Could you explain or expand on that a little bit more, please?
Yeah, I'd be really happy to. And I think I'll come back to this idea of chips. And compute is what they call it in the AI sector, like the specialized chips and infrastructure that you need to both build massive data centers to train the most advanced AI, and then also to deploy that AI at scale. And so in this paper, I argue that compute is the most defensible advantage that the US has for its leadership. And so to deconstruct that, let's take a look at like 5 key sort of inputs or like related parts of the supply chain for AI capability. So the first is data. And we see here that there's a potential for China to have a massive lead on the US when it comes to data used for AI training. We just look recent news at $1.5 billion settlement that Anthropic made for copyright, accusations of copyright violation and using stolen content. And then we've got China, where they have the ability to override such concerns for national interest. Sure, there's no silver bullets. They've had a lot of efforts to make central data exchanges work that have faced a lot of complications, but they may have the ability to unlock vast troves of data that are otherwise inhibited from being used in the US ecosystem. The second key area Sam touched on is talent. Yes, AI labs have been the most attractive workplaces for AI talent globally to date, but there has been a shift in receptiveness in the US to international students coming here. And China really does have strong talent pools. And we just have to look at DeepSeek, the AI startup in China that did an incredible job at optimizing on low amounts of compute for incredibly capable models. So I think talent is another area where the US could easily cede advantage to China. Energy for me is a really big one. So if you look at large-scale AI training and deployment at scale, some of the studies are saying that we need between 5 to 8 gigawatts of new energy capacity for a training run, a single advanced AI model being trained by 2030. And to put that in perspective, I think a regular nuclear power plant makes about 1 gigawatt. So we're looking at 5 to 8 of those by 2030 in demand in order to have this rapid growth in AI potential in the US. And so the Trump administration has taken pretty strong action on this. They've done some permitting reform as much as they can with executive action. They've taken a whack at it, but there's no silver bullet. And let's put it in perspective. Last year, China introduced about 400 gigawatts of new power compared to just dozens in the US. So there's another area where we're probably going to cede some kind of advantage to China. Robotics, an example where China is way ahead of where US capability is at, and an area where we are playing massive catch up. And so then we come to compute, which is like the 5th thing I think about. And that is the area where the US has a really clearly defined lead. With partners, the US controls the supply chain for specialized chips and infrastructure. That's where the competitive edge is. And moreover, if you look at how compute is used throughout the AI supply chain, so the more compute you have, the more capable base models you can train. The more compute you have, the better you can enhance those models for specific use cases. The more compute you have, the more you can let a model think over longer timeframes to get better results. And that means the more compute you have, the more experimentation you can do to design the next algorithms for the new generation of AI models. So it's almost this flywheel of like reinforcing advantage. And so when I think about what the US needs to do to, really strengthen its AI leadership, it comes back to, yes, compute you should continue to defend, but you cannot follow the Biden administration's path of, oh, we'll just, restrict everything and keep it at home. The Trump administration's right. How do you use this lead that compute gives you to solidify these advantages by partnering internationally? So beyond just focusing on the domestic, I think it's really important the US partners with really close, like-minded allies overseas to help unlock new energy sources and do some more AI training amongst the most trusted class of partners. And then I also think there's more to be doing to actually meet countries where they are in promoting AI applications. So at that level of the software stack, to say, here are models that we can fine tune for your particular use cases. Here are things that meet you, for example, in Norwegian ministers recently. So it's more around tailoring the partnerships towards what can actually meet countries where they have needs.
Great, thank you so much. And now turning to you, Owen, to look at the other side, what advantages does China have over the US regarding AI? I mean, Janet just alluded to some of them. For example, also you've written about how China uses AI as soft power. And then ultimately, how can the US offset these advantages that China does have?
Yeah, sure. So I think there have been a lot of kind of compelling points that have been raised about kind of the technical advantages the US has. I think one area that's harder to quantify, but is nonetheless pretty dynamic, is where China kind of stands today as a potential soft power broker when it comes to AI. So soft power, popularized by the late Joseph Nye, kind of refers to the ability to influence the preferences of other countries through shared values, attractiveness, economics, etc. And one of the big implications of DeepSeek, with DeepSeek's models, particularly its R1 model, was that it offered the performance of closed generative models in a much more affordable, less compute heavy form. And so I think accompanying this kind of open model push, so in AI, open models allow a greater range of actors to participate in AI research and development. Open models are very popular with kind of academic researchers, but I think what we've seen with DeepSeek is that there's also the potential to incorporate really performant models into economically beneficial kind of commercial purposes. And so essentially, China has kind of adopted rhetoric that it's able to diffuse very performant models to countries around the developing world. If you look at public opinion surveys, the developing world and the global south are actually more optimistic about the ways that AI could be economically transformative compared to countries in the West, Europe, and the United States. And so China, rhetorically, through its kind of global AI governance plan, which was released around the same time as the AI Action Plan, has really kind of boosted itself as a proponent for the global south when it comes to responsibly diffusing the benefits of AI. And so I think China's open science research ecosystem, which is traditionally used to kind of gain knowledge about emerging technologies, is now also kind of presenting itself as an avenue to diffuse the benefits of AI that CEOs and heads of state are really kind of heralding at these international conferences, like the Paris Summit in February. I think the kind of challenge for the United States is to really, as Janet alluded to, like keep its kind of allies and partners on side when it comes to AI. So rhetorically, I just mentioned how China's kind of embraced this. We're diffusing the benefits, we're incorporating the global south, etc. You've seen some kind of fractious rhetoric between the US and Europe, in particular, when it comes to the idea of AI regulation and the EU AI Act. The US kind of emphasizing this point that we need to remove the red tape from AI development, whereas Europe is very focused on kind of responsibly developing AI capabilities. And so politically, I think there's challenges to navigate when it comes to ensuring that the US can kind of keep its allies on the same page and assure them that it's also interested in responsibly developing AI capabilities. I think the action plan takes a few steps that are pointing in the right direction with this. The action plan really emphasizes the need to create open model alternatives to DeepSeek from the United States that can be beneficial for research and commercial applications. I think just a nuance to what Sam was discussing earlier with the action plan from a policy perspective, the action plan is essentially recommendations. It's not actually policy. So shortly after the action plan, there were 3 executive orders that the White House released. One on exporting the tech stack, as Janet mentioned, another one on kind of eliminating bias in models that they called eliminating woke AI. And then there was a third on kind of developing the compute infrastructure in the United States and removing some of the red tape with that. I think those executive orders point toward what probably the short-term priorities are for the United States when it comes to AI, whereas the action plan scope was a little bit broader, touched on a whole range of policy activities. And so I think when it comes to the areas the administration may be focusing on, it probably aligns slightly more with the EOs than with the broad scattershot approach of the action plan.
Great, thank you so much. And then now, Sam, looking kind of at the really big global picture, how will competition over AI dominance impact the global order, you think? You've spoken of an emerging age of AI diplomacy. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Sure, big question. So yeah, happy to speak about this at kind of different levels. I would begin by saying that there is a lot of uncertainty about this. So the range of forecasts about how AI will impact the economy, but also impact the military, impact global politics, really spans a kind of huge spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, there are people who think that this is going to transform everything on a very rapid time frame. This is going to just turbocharge state power. It's going to be, more significant than the invention of the nuclear bomb, that this could give states decisive strategic advantages that allow them to just impose their will on other states. That's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, there are people who think this technology will absolutely be important, but it's going to diffuse much more gradually. It's going to play out much more slowly. It's going to be very hard for any one state to kind of monopolize control over it. This is sort of more like it's not really like the invention of the nuclear bomb. It's more like a kind of general purpose technology like electricity that is much harder to sort of consolidate within any kind of one state. And depending on which one of these views you have, that could kind of leads to pretty different implications for how you assess AI's impact on the global order. That said, I think everyone does agree across this spectrum that AI is going to be this very important technology and that it really will influence economic power, military power, political power in general. And I think in terms of how that affects kind of global order, I think you could think about this from 2 perspectives. The first is for kind of great power competition at the kind of frontier between, say, the United States, China, the states that are really kind of that really have pretensions to be the kind of dominant states. And then the second perspective is how this affects everyone else, how this affects every other country. So just taking those in turn, I think on the kind of US-China competition, I think there really is this sense that AI is going to be a kind of crucial contributor or determinant of national power that may shape which one of these states kind of plays the preeminent role in the coming years, whether that's in terms of how these states integrate the technology into their militaries, which will shape their military power, but also how it impacts their economic growth, their productivity, and then this kind of broader diplomatic angle that a lot of our panelists have been talking about how these states promote these technologies, which embody, these are communication technologies that embody kind of political values. And so if US technology or Chinese technology kind of underpins these systems as they're spread worldwide, that will kind of shape international views, international attitudes, and so forth. And I think we don't really have a great answer to what geopolitics looks like in a world where both the US and China have access to extremely capable AI systems. I don't think anyone really knows what the sort of stable equilibrium is at the end of this race. We don't really know what winning means exactly. I think there are some people who think that only one of these states will get there first, and that will kind of lock in some sort of durable hegemony for that state. I'm a bit more skeptical of that view. There are others who think that we'll end up in a world where both the US and China have access to extremely capable AI systems, but I don't think anyone really knows what international politics will look like as this all shakes out. So that's from the kind of great power perspective. But then there's this whole other question for the rest of the world, all these kind of middle powers, for Europe, for large swathes of Asia. And I think there, countries that don't have access to the kind of frontier models, that are not designing and developing the models on the frontier, face a difficult challenge. And I think what those countries are kind of trying to do right now is they're realizing that AI, computing power, is going to be a crucial source of national power, and they're trying to figure out where they have leverage along the stack. So going back to the kind of partnerships that Janet was talking about, these countries are trying to figure out what is their offering that will give them leverage when they bargain with countries like the US or countries like China that are designing the kind of most powerful models. And so when this phrase, this emerging age of AI diplomacy, I think what a lot of that looks like is countries trying to figure out what they can offer to get in on the kind of coalition that's developing these models. What are they prepared to give up to get access to these models? And conversely, for countries like the United States that have the models, what are they prepared to kind of trade? What are they prepared to trade in exchange for access to the benefits of AI? So to give one concrete example, you could think about a country like the UAE or Saudi Arabia, these kind of Gulf states, who've decided that the way that they can compete here is by offering the ability to build massive data centers quickly using cheap energy, using subsidies. That's going to be their play to figure out how they can get sort of access to the benefits of this AI technology by offering that up to the US. In exchange, the US will build massive data centers in the Gulf. And that's sort of one example, just one kind of case study of what this sort of this age of AI diplomacy could look like, where countries are kind of bargaining over key AI inputs. But other countries, will not have the same resources that the Gulf states have to bear, and they'll have to figure out what are their sources of leverage, what are their kind of unique offerings that they can give, that they can use as leverage to kind of get access to these advanced AI technologies. And I think we're going to see that play out just across the world and across the AI stack that Janet was talking about earlier, as countries realize that AI is a kind of critical determinant of power, and they need to figure out ways to get in on the coalition that has access to this technology to make sure that they're not left behind. And that's going to shape negotiations just across the world in the coming years, I think.
Yeah, and that's absolutely fascinating. Yeah, it's hard. It's not like counting nuclear weapons, right? Who has more nuclear weapons? So anyway, we have one more question before we turn to the Q&A box. So if you have any questions, anybody participating today, please feel free to pop it in the Q&A box, and I'll try my best to get to it in the next section. But the question, it is all for you and for all three of you. And I'd start with you, Janet, following on actually very much on what you just said, Sam. Could we see a world split into two or more different and incompatible systems, what Sam Altman of OpenAI has called democratic versus authoritarian AI?
Thanks, Joanna. Yeah, I think about this question a fair bit and want to also express a fair degree of uncertainty, as Sam has outlined as well. I think anyone who's too confident in any assessments as to the future of AI is probably overconfident. But I think the distinction between democratic and authoritarian AI matters in a few ways. The first is that the leading power will have outsized influence in setting the norms and standards. And that could also be like things like risk management standards or how human and AI interactions happen. And there's a lot there that I think comes back to, that can be traced to, like, do you want to have democratic norms underpinning that, freedom of speech, those priorities, or do you want one that is a bit more surveillance oriented and aligning to certain ideologies? So I think it matters there. I think it also shapes the information environment as well. So as we're looking to the future of AI models, we're more and more training AI on something called synthetic data. And that's when you use AI to create really high quality data, grades each other, selects the best essays out of the ones you've instructed it to write. And then those become inputs into future AI training. That matters because if you have a Chinese model that obeys CCP ideology and deletes any reference to certain historical events like Tiananmen Square, there's a risk that over time that those things become diluted in the data ecosystem, and it really can shape the information environment that countries operate within. And then also a question that I'm still unsure about is, like, to what extent will network effects create reinforcing advantages for certain ecosystems? You could say that, greater deployment around the world gives you more access to data, more experimentation, the ability to upgrade and update more quickly based on different kinds of preferences. And I can see that sort of bolstering the leading AI player and sort of solidifying that advantage. But at the end of the day, it's the algorithms and the insights and those things are very easy to copy, to steal, to to get insights into through hiring someone who used to work at a lab. And I think that means we're going to continue to see ideas proliferate quickly across both ecosystems. The one other thing I'll say is that in many areas there isn't a clear distinction between democratic and sovereign AI. And I think that those terms are sometimes used a little bit too basically, because I think like we look at partnering with countries in the Gulf that don't always have a very strong human rights record, for example. And they're now part of the democratic ecosystem, I'm not sure. And then it's also AI is just incredibly general purpose and can be misused. Even one that's developed by a democratic society, the capabilities used for one thing for real beneficial purposes can be the very same things that undermine human rights or democratic values the next.
Great, thank you. And Owen, the same question. Do you see more than one system, and would it be democratic versus authoritarian, or something, as Janet alludes to, something kind of uncertain?
Yeah, I think there's a really unsatisfying answer of it depends. Like a lot of it will be dependent on the applications that different states use for these models, right? And I think a really kind of interesting distinction between the current period of emerging technologies and say like the Cold War is that private sector actors have such a larger role in shaping the way that this ecosystem is going to pan out. And so, I think there's a strain of kind of tapping into maybe government narratives. We saw since 2018, we really had this kind of great power competition narrative in US policy circles. And I think to some extent, you're seeing companies bounce a little bit off of that as they interact more with governments. But at the same time, like disentangling the relationships between the public and private sectors is going to be really important. So for instance, we saw some reporting this week that DeepSeek was ostensibly sharing a less secure version of its model based on different types of users that it was kind of seeing request access to the model weights and stuff. So I think there's a world where tech developed in different countries has different implications for use and security, and that could contribute to the extent to which it's diffused across different borders. It's possible that if there's a stream of uncertainty about the security of DeepSeek, for instance, you might see academic or commercial users turn to a different type of open model to do it. And that's less of a kind of democratic versus authoritarian distinction, perhaps, than like a kind of public-private sector trust distinction. And so I think it'll be fascinating to see how the kind of AI governance ecosystem shapes up in the next few years. I think there's a really serious question of, do we actually want US-China competition to manifest in AI governance in the way that it has in other tech sectors like 5G, where it was really kind of highly contentious and competitive. I think given the really powerful general purpose nature of this technology, we might want to keep those kind of standards bodies and forums kind of separate from competition. But whether or not that's really feasible at a political level, I think is a different question. So certainly a really dynamic time to be kind of adopting that framing.
Thank you so much. And then Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think this is like also another big question with a lot of uncertainty. And I think it goes back to what Janet was talking about in terms of these lock-in effects, the switching cost, the network effect. And I think that is a question that's very open. Whether one model, one company, one country's AI system will emerge that kind of locks everyone into using that system. If that's the case, then it may well be the case that you have kind of one US model that half the world uses and one Chinese model that half the world uses. That's one possible future. But another possible future is that the switching costs, people will switch between models all the time. Companies will switch between which models they use. And it could be a much more kind of fluid situation where it's not really, the whole world isn't divided into, one US model and one Chinese model. There's much more kind of switching around, experimentation. It's just a kind of much messier reality. And I think it's very unclear which of those models will play out, which of those worlds will play out. That depends a lot on whether any one of these companies can establish a kind of monopoly, whether it can kind of lock customers into using it, whether governments are trying to put pressure, like the US government is trying to put pressure on middle powers and swing states to kind of pick a side, be all in with the US tech ecosystem or all in with the Chinese tech ecosystem. Governments that are in the middle, countries that are in the middle, may want to resist that pressure. They may want to hedge and keep their options open. If you're the Indian government, you may not want to put all your chips in either one of those sides. And so I think how I think the relationship between the actual technical features of this technology, the economics of the technology, and the politics of it and the geopolitics of it, that will shape what the kind of world order looks like when it comes to this technology. And I think all of that, there's a huge amount of uncertainty around. I think the last thing I would say is that we still don't really know how to control the behavior of these extremely capable systems. And so that's another kind of risk factor that's going to feed into the kind of geopolitics and the economics of this. It's just these are increasingly capable systems that we're going to be rolling out into, wider swathes of the economy and the military. And as governments are trying to kind of compete with each other, trying to speed up the adoption of them, they also have to figure out how to kind of mitigate the risks associated with technologies they still don't really understand. And so that's just another kind of dimension of this whole geopolitical competition that we're going to see playing out in the coming years.
Thanks very much. All right. Let me now turn to some of the questions. There's one here. Can there be and should there be international regulation of AI? So maybe we'll start with you, Janet, on that, and anyone else can jump in.
Sure. They're two very different questions. Should there be? I mean, it'd be great if there was a joint. I think there's national security externalities that hit all countries when it comes to AI. I think I could imagine a world where there's strong consensus on, hey, there's some misuse risks here that everyone should align on and agree on. And how do we make sure this goes well for the world? And I think there's a lot of shared interests in making this go well. Can there be? I think at this moment, we're seeing a sort of retreat from multilateral organizations from Washington, D.C. And I'm not as optimistic that in the near term, there's going to be massive international regulations and consensus on AI. I think like even the way that Washington, D.C. approaches UN policymaking, it's not seen to be a particularly trusted or a venue that's going to have a lot of strong progress that gets the backing and buy-in from the US administration. So I think that it's something that we should all continue thinking about in terms of what would be the parameters of such a model. How do we make sure that those things are thought through and on the table if and when policy windows arise that becomes feasible? And maybe I'm not being optimistic enough, but I think at this moment, there's a really strong focus on American AI dominance. And that's the language that's used in policy documents. And that tends to be a little bit at odds with an international regulation approach. In the near term, I expect to see more in the sort of bilateral and unilateral engagements. And then maybe through that, they could build like shared norms and consensus, which could then formulate into international.
Yeah, if I could just add one comment there, I think, there's an interesting divide between, as Janet mentioned, the way that the US is kind of proceeding kind of unilaterally with friends is maybe one way to think about it. China, on the other hand, particularly in some of its recent AI governance documents, has really emphasized working through the venue of the UN. And so I think China has an appetite to kind of use that kind of broad multilateral forum that's maybe seen as less shaped by kind of US and allied influence than the US does at the moment. I think just speaking briefly to the point on kind of international regulations, probably one of the areas that's a good example for AI is in the space of autonomous weapons, where we've seen the group of governmental experts at the Convention on Certain Conventional Weapons basically kind of trying to establish norms and international regulations around autonomous weapons for over a decade. And I think a major hurdle for that group and kind of a challenge is that the technology can just really kind of supersede the pace of debate very quickly and discussion. And so I think a kind of challenge in taking a multilateral approach is that you have to manage the interests of many stakeholders. And I think there's a question about, with technologies where the development trajectory is so uncertain, is that really a feasible approach? I think it's an open question.
Great, thank you. And then this question, it'll be for you, Sam. How do you weigh the financial expenditure, the electrical requirements, and the water needs for cooling data centers on AI versus the previously international agreed upon climate goals?
Yeah, so that's a big question, and I would say I'm not a climate expert or an energy expert, but there are clearly tensions here. data centers, we're seeing that data centers are becoming, one of the biggest drivers of electricity, of growing energy demand, growing electricity demand, increase, a lot of companies had made net zero commitments, and there is increasing kind of uncertainty about whether those commitments will be able to coexist with their desire to kind of massively expand data center construction. So yeah, lots of environmental issues here, lots of energy issues. I think in the long run, I personally am sort of relatively optimistic in the long run, in that I do think these technologies will unlock lots of new ways of finding efficiencies of reducing energy use in the long run. Optimizing processes just across the economy that I think will ultimately squeeze some emissions out of the system. But in the short run, it's clearly going to be an obstacle to progress on climate change. So I don't think governments have good, I don't think I think this administration in the United States at the moment clearly wants to prioritize all out an all out sprint to kind of make it easier to build massive data centers. It wants to unlock most forms of energy, though it clearly is not sympathetic to solar and wind, but other forms of energy it wants to unleash to fuel that kind of AI data center boom. Other governments may well take a different perspective on this, may well be much more skeptical of some of the benefits of that relative to the costs in water use and energy use in general. So I would just say there are trade-offs here. I don't know the right answer to that question, but different governments will fall in different places on that issue.
Great, thank you. And then this question, I think it would be for you, Owen, but of course, anyone else feel free to jump in. In the book, AI Superpowers, the author mentions that China has an advantage in building a high quantity of well-trained engineers. So regarding talent, can you please discuss the difference between having the high-end research talent, scientists, versus the quantity of engineers who can team up with entrepreneurs to operationalize?
Yeah, sure. So I can speak a little bit to this. I'm not a workforce expert necessarily, but so China has been increasing the number of PhDs that it graduates. PhDs in the context of AI are typically the ones who are producing the kind of cutting edge algorithms for different AI capabilities. And so they're often at the frontier of research. Engineers, as you kind of alluded to, on the other hand, are, depending on the type of AI capability, helping to integrate it into systems. We've seen since 2007, China's had a lead over the United States in the number of STEM PhDs that it produces, which is kind of a rough marker of the AI talent that companies are producing. Part of that is population dynamics, right? Like China has a far larger population than the United States, but there is evidence that suggests that the quality of Chinese PhDs is increasing over time, in addition to kind of the raw numbers. And so I think the challenge when it comes to thinking about these kind of disparities in STEM PhDs goes back to like the talent question for the United States. Sam mentioned earlier, the US has relied quite heavily on kind of external talent in its ecosystem. And in a world where the political environment is becoming less kind of accommodating to that external STEM talent, I think that is probably more of a concern than the numbers of engineers and kind of PhDs that China's producing alone, right? Like the US has kind of really benefited from using immigration and incorporating it into its technology talent ecosystem. And so I think there's a couple different factors at play. There is the like kind of China outproducing the US in terms of STEM talent, but there's also the possibility that the US struggles to retain some of the talent that comes over here to study in universities at the undergraduate and graduate level. So it's a good question. I think it's a really important area to watch. And these are the effects that tend to lag, right? So they're things that are hard to measure and kind of quantify in the moment until you're kind of a few years past them. So I think we're at the point where we can see the kind of downsides to the policy, but I don't think we fully understand what it will mean for the US competitiveness in AI until we're a couple of years down the road.
I think you're muted, John.
Joanna, you're muted.
Sorry, thank you. And this is a question related to what you were just speaking about, Owen, about how many of the top AI experts in the US are Chinese, and they came to school here to be educated. So is there a risk to US security?
I'm happy to jump in on that one. Yeah, it's just a matter of different kinds of risks. And I think the biggest risk to US security is to kick out the most exquisite AI experts and send them back to China. I think when I think about these issues, I'm like, how do you actually do a reverse brain drain into the US? But I've got a bit of a background in the countering foreign interference space, and something that comes up is often you want to think about what leverage people have over individuals. And often that is your immediate family members. And so if you are serious about, and this is really at odds with this, the current administration's approach to immigration in terms of bringing more people in necessarily. But I think if you wanted to do AI well, you want to attract the leading experts from around the world, regardless of where they are. And for countries where their family members might be put under undue influence and used as leverage against them, bring the family across too. At the end of the day, these people are choosing to come to the US. I think most people, when they spend time in the US, want to stay in the US. And the opportunities afforded here are just exceptional compared to, for example, in China in many different ways. Just look at DeepSeek's engineers, I think, are no longer able to travel without approval, some of them, because the CCP is worried about losing that talent. So I think in the US context, you want to be bringing people here and then to mitigate against security risks, making sure that you can manage any kinds of leverage that are held against them.
And I think there are, just to add one brief additional note to that, there are kind of ways that you can reduce the risks with those researchers. You know, maybe you restrict Chinese researchers in the US access to classified data. You know, maybe you restrict certain kinds of work they can do in the US, but that's a kind of much more kind of finely tailored response to a set of real risks that might come from foreign researchers in the US, as opposed to kind of taking a much blunter measure that might be just kind of banning all Chinese students from American universities. I think the kind of collateral damage and the kind of cost that Janet was talking about are much higher with that sort of sweeping response to a real trade-off in terms of the risks. But I think there were kind of narrower policy responses to that can mitigate some of the damage from kind of blunter force restrictions.
Right. And I think if you're looking at developing commercial applications, right, the implications of that relative to national security are quite different. And so it might be that you're restricting the types of people who work on certain projects based on their dependencies, like Janet alluded to. But if you take the view of someone like Jeff Ding, who's written a great book about AI diffusion, you want as many people to help you kind of diffuse this technology as possible in order to realize the benefits. And so I think that certainly outweighs the kind of narrow national security concern in some respects.
Great, thank you. Here's another question, and please feel free to jump in who feels most comfortable answering this. The best webinar, sorry, where is this? Oh, I'm so sorry. There was a question regarding who profits from AI and how much of that is driven. Yes, they're saying listed more than 300 billionaires. Most of these are AI tech related. How will this distort decision-making by China and the US and other countries? Meaning, is money going to drive this more than political or national security considerations?
I can take an initial stab at that, or go for it, Jana.
No, you go.
I mean, I don't. So certainly, individual billionaires, that's one issue. I think that's kind of a subset of a broader policy issue here, which we've kind of talked a little bit about throughout this panel, which is that a lot of these technologies are coming out of the private sector, and the private sector has a set of incentives and interests that sometimes align with the national interest, but sometimes don't. Whether that's because of the particular individuals who are the kind of CEOs of these companies, they may have their own set of kind of idiosyncratic views, their idiosyncratic beliefs that they want to pursue, or whether it's just following market incentives that may push policy in one direction, whereas policymakers in DC who are elected to serve a kind of broader constituency may want policy to go in a different direction. And so navigating this tension between private incentives and public incentives, I think is going to be a really challenging problem in the coming years, just because this is a technology, unlike past technologies, that has huge national security implications, but is coming out of the private sector primarily, which was just not the case with nuclear weapons or kind of past critical military technologies, which were designed by the government. And so I think that's going to be a really hard challenge, a really hard needle to thread. Because if you entirely ignore, if policymakers in DC entirely emphasize national security concerns and ignore the interests of companies, they're going to they're going to eat into the revenues of these US companies, and those revenues are critical for fueling US R&D, which in turn in the long run shapes US national power. So it's not, so US policymakers can't just ignore the interests of these companies, and those companies themselves are, have a lot of money to spend on lobbying and on influence campaigns and so forth. So US policymakers neither can nor should totally ignore the interests of private companies. At the same time, they also shouldn't be entirely deferential to them, because that could lead us to, greenlight the sales of technologies to US adversaries and US competitors. And so every administration is going to face this difficult balancing act of how do you weigh private interests, private incentives versus national security ones. I think the Biden administration drew that line in one place. The Trump administration is drawing it in another place. You can have your own views on, which of these administrations is drawing that line in the right place. And there's always going to be allegations of kind of corruption and so forth inherent in that. But just from the broader policy perspective, it's always going to be a difficult balancing act to thread.
And I think sorry, I was just going to say, to tack onto that point, I think the profit motive influences the kind of soft power piece that we were talking earlier about, where companies may not necessarily have profit motive to try to diffuse technology to countries that are maybe less developed or less capable of kind of affording the cutting edge. And so I think that is where you get a really kind of dynamic balance between how AI is diffused to the haves and have-nots, and the level of, like, the extent to which governments have to actually step in and kind of help to do that, especially if it becomes the type of scenario where the type of scenario we discussed earlier, where getting half of the world on one type of model versus the other becomes something that's actually significant. Sorry, Janet.
No, a really great point. The only thing I had to add to that is that I think at the moment a real risk is that the US government doesn't have a really sophisticated internal AI center of expertise. They've got the start of one, which is the CASI, the Center for AI Innovation and Standards, used to be their AI Safety Institute, but they've rechanged that. But I guess at the moment, the public sector is almost entirely dependent on private sector insights and technical expertise as to where the frontier of AI is. And that's of concern, because you really need to have that in some kind of internal picture. If this is the most transformative technology of our times, you want to be ensuring that your public policy is based in, like, an evidence base and as unbiased as possible assessment of where things are up to.
Great, thank you. And so now, with the 2 minutes we have remaining, so not much time, but I wanted to ask one final question. What do you think of New York Times columnist Tom Friedman's argument that it is better for the US and China to cooperate on certain aspects of AI, such as best practices for AI safety, than only to be in competition with each other? Can such cooperation happen, and what would involve? So I know lightning round of 2 minutes. So why don't we start with you, Janet?
Sure. I think it's essential to cooperate on certain aspects of AI with China. And even within this, like the current administration, I think that is something that is going to have to be done. COVID-19 is an example of a risk that happens in one jurisdiction and spreads. And I think there's a lot of risks, whether it's automated cyber or other, like, bioweapons or things like that, where there's shared interests in making sure that things are not misused, and misuse in any one jurisdiction can impact others. So I think that there's strong incentives, and we need to be bolstering that engagement.
Great, thank you. Sam?
I completely agree with everything Janet just said. I think some level of coordination and communication between the US and China on this is going to be critical. It's going to be very difficult to balance that with the reality that both states are going to be competing, especially since the race is so close that neither state yet feels comfortable being willing to negotiate. But I think some level of coordination and negotiation and joint research, joint testing, some degree of that, I think is going to be essential and inevitable.
Thank you. And Owen?
Yeah, I think we answered an earlier question by drawing a distinction between can and should. And I think cooperation should happen. Whether it can happen in the current moment is a bit of a a kind of open, slightly ominous question. I do think this is one area where there is kind of good opportunity to look at precedents from things like the Cold War in the US and kind of Soviet discussions around nuclear security. I think there's a lot of ways that those kind of analogies get misused, but I think the idea of kind of having open dialogue among rivals and competitors is really important, particularly in such a potentially transformative space.
Well, I want to thank you, Owen, Janet, and Sam for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I know you've given people a lot of food for thought, especially on a subject that not everyone is up to date with. So I very much appreciate you participating in the panel today. And over to you, Courtney.
All right. And yeah, just want to echo Joanna's thanks to Janet, Sam, and Owen. Thanks everyone for the great questions. Joanna for the moderating. A couple of just quick points. I feel like we should have a follow-up discussion then to this. What would it take to have China and the US cooperate on this? So maybe we'll be able to put that together. And we also touched upon the security issue and education, and which is something that we're actually going to be talking about next week. So this is our webinar on September 22nd, free and open to everyone around the world. So please do share it. And then we do have some other upcoming events also on city diplomacy that we'll be doing in October. And just stay tuned for other events as well. And we are a nonprofit and we rely on support. So if you can donate, we encourage you to donate. And regardless, we hope that you share our information and our events widely. So thank you all. Have a great day, everyone. Really appreciate it.